All right. And so, for everybody tuning in, thank you for coming into another edition of Interview with the Historian. Today, we have the wonderful opportunity to interview Dr. Podany here. She does teach here at our university. A little bit of background if you don't know her. She has her PhD in history in the ancient Near East from the University of California, Los Angeles, or UCLA as we know. She's the author of a few numerous books. The most recent work is Weavers, Scribes, and Kings, A New History of the Ancient Near East. One book I did want to mention too, which I'm such a huge fan of the series, it's the Oxford, A Very Short Introduction, where she talks about the Near East. For those of you that don't want to dive into the expansive world of that time, these short introductions are just amazing. I mean, they really give you an idea of what it looks like and also gives you context into more books to further your reading. So to get started, the first question I'm curious is, what led you into the vastness of the ancient world?
Well, thank you, Jeremy, and thank you for inviting me to be interviewed. That is a really good question. I goes back to when I was 8 years old, and I lived in England, and we dug things up in my backyard. I mean, there was history in the ground, and I thought it was fascinating, and continued to be interested in the past, in history and archaeology, especially. I thought I wanted to be an
Mm.
archaeologist. Um, and I did all the way through my master's degree, I was going to go into archaeology because I thought that was the best way for me to investigate the ancient world. But then I learned to read cuneiform, which is the ancient
Mm.
script of the Mesopotamians. And I found I enjoyed reading the texts more than I enjoyed digging in the ground. And so I switched to history. But I think my main interest was just the beginnings of cities, the beginnings of,
Mm.
that big change that humans went through from being in small communities, being in, small villages, to the kind of existence that has dominated human experience ever since, with
Mm.
dominated some aspects of human experience, which is this urban culture. And so looking at the very beginnings of urban culture, I found very, very interesting.
Oh yeah, and I think when in my own personal research for fun, one thing that blew my mind was learning the scope of these places, and it wasn't kind of like when we look at Hollywood movies or Hollywood renditions of it. It's like these small little communities with minor pyramids, but they're big societies and they were complex. I mean,
They were. And the other thing to remember is they lasted for such a long time. When you
mhm.
take a world history class and they do ancient history in the first couple of weeks, my field of ancient history, it's 3,000 years of history
Mhm.
that the ancient Middle East covers. And that's more time than since the sort of transformation of that culture took place, and we no longer consider it ancient, which was about 1,500 years ago. That's not that long, considering how long the
Mhm.
the culture survived beforehand.
Oh yeah, and its impact too, especially how we associate and how we do things. I made a joke once with my dad when I used to work holidays, and he was surprised that I was working another holiday, and he asked me why. And I made a joke. I said, "Well, someone all the way back in the ancient Mesopotamia developed an urban environment. Now I have to work 9 to 5." Um, so it's an ongoing joke I actually love. Um, One thing, and I find it fascinating too. It's when we look at that time frame. It's also kind of often associated with. It's almost like they weren't as sophisticated as we are now. But when we actually look at that, and individuals like you that actually dedicate the time to study it, and you present work that's the complete contrary. So what has that been like for you as far as a personal experience, but also sharing that with others to look into that area?
You mean the sort of misconception of what people think of as might be that it might have been primitive? Is that what you mean? Yeah, I
Yes.
think that's a really good point. The I think what one has to realize is that they were completely modern humans in the terms of evolution. We have not
Mm.
evolved since that time. In 5,000 years, human beings haven't evolved. And so they had all our capacity to think, to talk, to reason. They would, if you could
Mhm.
have taken a Mesopotamian baby and brought them up in the present day, they would be completely indistinguishable from anybody else, in the
Mhm.
society. But they were living within the time that they were living, and so they didn't have our technology, of course, and they didn't have our um, well, so much, in modern society that they didn't have. But that said, they had all of our inventiveness and our sense of right and wrong, and our sense of wanting, a good life for themselves. All of this, there's a lot that's really shared.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a misconception that life in the ancient world was just so different that it's incomprehensible. But it isn't. You
Mm-hmm.
read about these people and they have lives that are recognizable and concerns that are recognizable. And when they wrote letters, they sometimes sound like letters that might have been written yesterday for the things that they're worrying about. And that's something that I really want people to realize, because one reason I think that the ancient world doesn't get the attention that it deserves is there's a sense that, oh, it's just so distant and so sort of remote from our own experience that somehow it can't be interesting. Whereas that the opposite is true. It's just fascinating. And then you see people coping with things like there's no mass communication. So how are you going to get a message to someone? How are you going to communicate with them over a long distance? How are you going to make sure that the two of you can meet up somewhere, at a particular time, when you don't have texts and you don't have email? I mean,
Yeah.
they got along just fine. And I think too, we tend to think that they must have been sitting around wishing that they had clocks and phones. And of course they didn't. They had no idea those were coming. They didn't. They didn't bemoan the things that hadn't happened yet because they had no idea they were going to happen. They lived just fine with the level of technology and the level of sophistication that they had.
Yeah, and I think technology even kind of gets knocked down, as you mentioned. And I find whenever I talk to anybody about the ancient world, when I mention certain technological advances that they had, and for whatever reason, I don't know what it is, there's a whole study, I could do a study on this alone. When I mentioned the use of cranes, how they had cranes back then, that's the baffling, mind-blowing moment. It wasn't their sophistication in language or anything like that. But I find when, people that don't
I,
know, yeah,
Honestly, I wouldn't use cranes because they didn't really, nothing like the cranes we have now.
you're right.
They had levers, but when you look at the images of building, the remarkable thing is that they did so much building without cranes, honestly. To take the example of Egypt, which is not my field, but I do teach ancient Egypt. All of that enormous amount of construction that they did was done without the benefit of the types of modern technology that we have, like cranes. That makes it all the more remarkable. I mean, I think it's frustrating to me that people will sometimes say, oh, it must be ancient aliens, because how could humans have done it without our technology?
Yeah.
And that's crazy. They could do it because they were smart and they figured stuff out. So
Yeah.
they did have some things that are really surprising, like concrete, for example. There's an example of somebody dreaming up concrete around 3500 BCE, 5,500 years ago. They sort of thought, well, if we mix some plaster and bricks and we set it, incredible. Romans had really they had a waterproof concrete, really fascinating technologies like that, and they had something that one doesn't think of as being a remarkable technological advance, which is a chariot that could go fast and that had spoked wheels. And that doesn't sound very advanced, but actually it really is, because to have a tight turning circle and to be able to make the wheels round enough and strong enough that you could charge over a battlefield, and to balance everything perfectly so that the chariot was stable on its and only two wheels. That kind of thing, you realize there's a real genius behind it. But many things, lost wax bronze casting, for example, that the thinking that went into that so that bronze could be cast. Irrigation, they had incredible irrigation technology with not just sort of getting water into canals, but all kinds of flood control mechanisms that prevented the water from flooding all over the fields. They had a lot. Cranes, don't think so, actually. Not in the period that I'm looking at. But without them, they still did incredible feats of construction.
Right.
And they had engineering abilities and mathematical understanding so that they could actually calculate the number of bricks they would need for a building
Mm,
and order them ahead of time. And they could calculate the amount of mortar they needed between the bricks. And then the level of organization as well as the
mm.
level of technology is really impressive.
Oh, definitely. Um, so kind of tying it into that, I was really curious as far as when you discover this and you go through the primary sources, how you mentioned cuneiform, when you read through them and understand them completely, how does that affect the type of history you can write about and present?
Yes, cuneiform, actually, that's a wonderful difference between the history of the ancient Middle East and much of the rest of ancient history, is because, as you said, they wrote in cuneiform, which is a wedge-shaped
Mhm,
script. And they wrote it on clay almost always, sometimes on stone. But because they wrote on clay because that's what they had a lot of. This is River
mhm,
Valley, there's lots of clay. And and it's a wonderful medium because it survives really, really, really well in the ground. So that
mhm,
if you think about what was used in other cultures, like papyrus in Egypt, and papyrus was also used in Greece and Rome, it was used in regions of ancient Israel and Palestine, that doesn't survive well. It's made of reeds, and you can imagine after 5,000 years, something made of
yeah.
reeds, there's not much left of it, unless it was left in the desert where it dried out, like some of the
Mm,
Egyptian papyri and the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, in
mm,
Israel. But most of it's gone. I mean, almost all of the documentation from those regions is gone. And the same is true if you write on animal skins, like leather,
mm,
parchment. So lots of ancient cultures suffer with the fact that there's almost nothing that was written at the time that comes down to us. But from
mm,
Mesopotamia and the other parts of the Middle East where they wrote on clay, it survives. So when you excavate and you talk about your question, when you find something like this, the amazing thing is digging in the ground in these regions. There are places where they found thousands of tablets,
mm,
literally thousands, in a single palace, for example, that mean that we have just this incredible wealth of data about stuff that they didn't necessarily want us to know. Or rather, it's not they didn't want us to know. They didn't think of the future when they were writing it. So
yeah.
just like, if you rent an apartment, right, and you fill out the forms
Mhm,
for the apartment, probably do it online now, but not that long ago we would do it on paper. And you would, fill it out, and you say, your income, and you say what you're going to pay for rent
mm,
and what's the terms and so forth. You don't think that some historian 500 years from now or 5,000 years from now is going to find your rental contract and go, aha, here we have the key to the 21st century. Now we understand. You're just doing it so that you can rent an apartment. Well,
right.
that's just what they were doing. They would keep records of renting a house or buying a field or hiring a worker or
Mm,
getting married. They had marriage contracts or making a list of people who were working on a building site. None of that was intended to be kept forever. These were just things that
mm,
they wrote at the time. But they've survived forever. I mean, they've survived thousands of years. And so we can do kinds of social and economic history
mm,
um, on the ancient Near East that is really difficult to do for most of ancient history because the documents are gone.
right.
It makes it such a rich field for understanding not just the rich and powerful people in society, but those workers on building sites.
Mm.
We can look at them too, and I find that just fascinating.
Oh yeah, I bet. And I'm sure it's reassuring too to know that aliens did not create all these things. I
Exactly.
think that's the
Yes.
funniest thing I always find is like it's instead of pouring into the research that has been done by historians like yourself, it's this weird connection. Aliens must have done it. Uh,
Honestly, Jeremy, I think in a way it's just um, it's a bit dismissive it's because people don't understand the ancient world well. I think they
mm,
think, oh, it must be some more powerful being than us because we couldn't have done that, or those people back then couldn't have done that.
mhm,
When in fact they could, and they did,
yeah.
and they were precise and they were careful with their work. And maybe because one has the image of the sort of caveman as though that was this time, and it isn't
Mm,
at all. This is long, 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 long after that. That there's a sort of assumption that everything must have been kind of sloppy and not
mm.
done very well. So not true. They were so meticulous with the things that they did.
Oh yeah, and I mean, good thing for us too, especially when we look back and we're able to understand it even better.
Yeah.
So one thing I've always been kind of curious about is, I mean, I can't read cuneiform, complete disclaimer. But I've been curious when you look at cuneiform and how they wrote, and I know this is a little bit of a time difference here, but one thing that looking to archaeology and history and tying it together and looking at these tablets, was there any not language barrier, but more deciphering barrier? And the only example I really know how, or I know off the top of my head is, and again, it's a little bit of time jump, but Cyrus's cylinder.
Hmm.
And I'm familiar that in that cylinder, as they're deciphering it, there's some historians that the it was the name Belteshazzar or Belshazzar. And
Belshazzar.
yeah, so some historians are will argue, as far as I know to this date, is the deciphering of, is it the Belshazzar, as for example from the Bible, and
Oh
as
yeah. Yes. Oh, okay. A couple of different issues you've raised there. So I wanted to talk about each one of them.
mm,
First off, cuneiform was deciphered in the middle of the 19th century.
mm,
So it is well understood. And it was used to write a lot of different languages. So some of the languages are extremely well understood. The one that was first, the first cuneiform that was deciphered was actually Old Persian, but that's a very late version of cuneiform.
mm,
Next came the language of Akkadian. And
mm,
Akkadian is a Semitic language. It was spoken across the Middle East, especially in Mesopotamia, but it was also used as the lingua franca for other cultures as well. So it
mm,
was used in diplomacy, it was used in letter writing, and that is a very, very well understood language.
mm,
The language that came before it was Sumerian, also written in cuneiform, also well understood now. But there are some languages that were written in cuneiform that are much less well understood, like, for
mm,
example, the language of Elamite, which was spoken in the mountains near Mesopotamia. But as with any
mm.
script, if you think about the script we use, the Latin script, we can write any language in it. And
Mm.
hypothetically, one could write any language in cuneiform. That if you use
Oh
that
wow.
script, because it's phonetic, it's a
Mm,
phonetic script, um, you could write English in cuneiform if you wanted to. I don't know why you would, but you could. And so they used it for
mm,
so many languages. Hittite and Hurrian and many, many languages of the ancient world were written in cuneiform. So there's that. Um, Cyrus's cylinder is a particular moment in history
mm,
when the king named Cyrus of Persia came into Mesopotamia as a conqueror in 539 BC. And he was overthrowing the government and the regime of a man named Nabonidus,
mm,
and whose actual name isn't Nabonidus. That's what the Greeks called him, so we call him Nabonidus. His name was Nabu-Naid, but close enough. Um, he was someone who had a son uh, whose name is in the Bible written as Belshazzar. That's not how it
mm,
was written either by him or by Cyrus. But it's close enough that we know that when the
mm,
Bible refers to Belshazzar, it's referring to Nabonidus' son. The confusing part is that the Bible credits Belshazzar as being the son of Nebuchadnezzar, which he wasn't.
mm,
Nebuchadnezzar didn't have a son named Belshazzar, and there was a confusion in the book of Daniel between Nabonidus and Nebuchadnezzar. That the person described as Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel has all the characteristics of Nabonidus. He went off into exile. He was
mm,
obsessed with dreams. He had a son named Belshazzar. He was considered to be a little insane. So what just happened was that the authors got the name wrong. So the Belshazzar, who is, I don't think there's any dispute about the fact that Belshazzar is indeed the son of Nabonidus.
mm,
The only question comes is just in biblical interpretation of how it came that Belshazzar was attributed to being the son of Nebuchadnezzar, when in fact he didn't
mm,
have a son named that. But um, that's not so much about decipherment
mm.
as it is about biblical history.
Yeah, and I find that so interesting too, is, and like you mentioned how you can do cuneiform in different languages, and I think that's one thing, like example, like how I mentioned, this is all different for me, and I've always associated the ancient world, even though like you mentioned, we talked about it's connected,
Mhm.
but it's almost kind of like two different worlds connected.
Mhm.
Um, and I think it's so interesting to even note that, and I don't want to like go into the well. I don't want to go into like the Bible as a historical text, but I find that interesting is you can connect through that same linguistic form with all these different languages. And I'm curious if you wouldn't mind going into it a little bit of how is it that they came to using cuneiform to be able to communicate? Did they find that easier, or how did that go?
It was the first script ever invented. So it wasn't easier or harder than anything. It was just what they came up with. Initially, the very earliest stages,
Mhm.
which is called proto-cuneiform, before it was actually the fully formed cuneiform script, it was an accounting system. It wasn't even an attempt to represent language. It was very ingenious, actually. It seems as though the administrators of the early cities
Mhm.
in southern Mesopotamia, they needed a way of keeping track of things that you just can't memorize, like how many
Mhm.
sheep had arrived at the temple on a particular day, or how many bushels of barley, or
Mhm.
how many jugs of beer were going out of a particular warehouse. It's not the kind of thing anybody can memorize the way that you memorize poetry or something like that. So they would just write on a clay tablet, 3 cow, 6 sheep, 2 bushels, and
Mhm.
those signs were pictures. They weren't even wedge-shaped signs yet. They were little pictures of a cow or a little picture of a grain of barley. And so it really isn't a script yet because it's not in any particular language. You could read that in German, you could read it
Mhm.
in Italian, you could read it in Spanish, whatever. They read it in whatever language they were speaking at the time, which was probably Sumerian, but we don't know for
Mhm.
sure because it's not a script that represents a language. Gradually, though, they got really ingenious, and they would use it so that the sign for example, an arrow, you can draw an arrow, and that
Mhm.
the word for arrow in Sumerian is ti, um, but it's also the word for life. So if you wanted to write the word life, you could draw an arrow, and you would read it the
Mhm.
same way. So you would get the sound T, and you could say, because how do you draw life? Can't really
Yeah.
draw life, but you could then use that the arrow to represent the word life, or you could just use it for the sound T. And
Mhm.
once they started using these signs phonetically, then we can see that they were writing Sumerian, and that um, the script becomes both phonetic, and it changes its appearance. It no longer looks like
Mhm.
pictures after a while. They would make these little tiny wedge-shaped signs. Well, each sign is made up of a bunch of little wedges. And the wedges give their name to cuneiform because cuneus in
Mhm.
Latin means wedge. So it was wedge-shaped writing. It's not what they called it, it's what we call it because it was named, in the modern era. Um, but they used it for hundreds of years because that's what writing was. They didn't
Mhm.
think, oh, this isn't very good, we need something better. It worked fine. It
Mhm.
could represent anything they wanted to write. It was only, gosh, 2,000 years or so after the invention of cuneiform that an alphabet really started to spread. And then an alphabet is much, much easier. In cuneiform, you
Mhm.
need at least 600 signs really to be
Wow.
able to write sort of fluently. You could write what you needed to write in about 120 signs, but it's still a lot of signs to memorize.
Mhm.
Whereas with an alphabet, they had like 24, 22 in some of
Mhm.
the earliest alphabets. And so it was much easier to learn an alphabet. And those then spread widely once they were invented. But it was 2,000 years before they invented an alphabet.
Oh wow, and that's a lot. Now,
Yeah.
when you studied and you actually, well, I'm assuming you're like a master at cuneiform now, and was it particularly difficult? And if so, what were certain aspects of it that made it hard?
It is hard. It's hard for two reasons. One is that you just have to memorize so many signs,
Mhm.
and they're different in different eras. So the signs that the Sumerians use are very different from the signs that were used in the period that I study, which is the Old Babylonian
Mhm.
period and the Middle Babylonian period. And then they changed again by the time of, say, the Neo-Assyrians in the first millennium BC.
Mhm.
Um, so you're learning a lot of different signs and lots of different sign forms, so that a sign that you
Mhm.
recognize if you're working in Sumerian looks completely different if you're looking at it in Neo-Assyrian.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of just memorizing, just tons of memorizing of signs. Then there's lots of memorizing of the words,
Mhm.
and the grammar is very different. There's Sumerian is a completely different language from Akkadian. It has nothing in common with it in terms of its language family. Akkadian, as I say, is Semitic, so it's related to Hebrew and Arabic and Aramaic and a number of other Semitic languages. But Sumerian is not related to anything. And when I learned Sumerian in graduate school, it was really tough because they just think differently from how we do. They didn't have what we would recognize as a present, past, and future tense. They could say things, but they didn't have a verb tense in order to do it. They would say, yesterday I go, or something like that. So they could find ways of putting it into the past. But then they could express things in their verbs that we can't express in English. Like the relationship between the two people who are talking to one another. There is a sort of aspect to the verb that has these sort of nuances that in English we can't say. So it's a very interesting, subtle language, but it's a tough one. And I learned Hittite in graduate school as well, although I haven't used Hittite. But so it was a lot of graduate school was spent just learning the languages and learning the script and learning the grammar of the 3 languages I chose to learn. But a lot of people in my field know 5 or 7 languages. I did my PhD in history. If you do your PhD in ancient Near Eastern languages, then you learn many more languages, because mine was in history and history.
Yeah, learning English alone sounds difficult. That sounds pain.
Well, no, the good thing, Jeremy, is that you never have to speak it. So unlike if you learn a modern language, somebody expects you to walk into a room and have a conversation. There's no one alive who speaks these languages anymore. So there's that sort of pressure is removed. You don't ever have to sit down with a Sumerian person and ask it for a cup of tea.
And what's I think what's so fascinating about that too is not only is it's a lost language per se, but it's interesting because not a lot of people when you talk to now, like students, myself, we're not jumping the gun to study ancient history, and for those that I've spoken to, it's always Roman and Greek. They're the poster children of the ancient world. And I'm kind of curious, do you know how many people like you speak or are able to read and write in cuneiform?
That's a good question. A few hundred in the world, I would think.
Wow.
Something like that. I mean, I don't know, because there are people who did PhDs in the field and didn't stay. So they could read it, but they didn't, they're not professors or people who are actually working in the field. That's a really good question. I would say no more than a couple of hundred, I would think.
Wow, and that's remarkable.
But honestly, part of the reason for that is that it's a field in which there aren't many jobs. So the two sort of it's kind of a cycle in that it would be probably a bad idea for a whole lot of people to go to graduate school and learn it, thinking they would get a job at the end when there really aren't any. I'm one of, I think, 2 people in the California State University system who can read cuneiform and who are in my field. So it's not, and that's in 23 campuses. I mean, there's just not a lot of demand, which is too bad. I wish there was more interest and therefore there would be more demand. But we do what we can.
Yeah, of course, and it is sad. I mean, I think it's particularly sad because eventually, right, how much longer before it essentially dies out and just becomes something that's not lost to text, but
no, I don't think it will die out. I think it's always been a small field. It's never been something where there were, ever since they deciphered the languages in the 19th century, there's never been an enormous number of people doing the work, but there's always been enough, people to keep it going. And I think actually we mentioned Greece and Rome. Of course, Greece and Rome are important, but they have a disproportionate representation among historians. If you think about a department of history, a lot of departments of history feel like, oh, we've got a Greek and Romanist, we've got the ancient world. That is a tiny, tiny part of the ancient world. It's not just Mesopotamia and Egypt, but there's India, there's China, there's the Central Asia, there's Central America. There's so many regions of the world that have ancient history. The idea that you've got ancient history if you've got a Greek or Romanist is, I think, misplaced. And I hope that history departments will become more aware of the fact that that's a little bit Eurocentric, that it's a very old-fashioned approach to, well, what's ancient? Well, it's Greece and Rome, because that's what gave birth to the West, as they used to think. And of course, later they realized that the Greeks and the Romans borrowed a lot from the cultures around them that were earlier. So I don't know. I don't think it's going away. I don't think this is the sort of beginnings of the end of the study of the ancient Middle East. I think it's still a vibrant field. And of course, it's a field which is growing in the regions in which the culture thrives. So Iraq, for example, has a growing number of scholars who are mastering the languages and working in the field. And that was happening in Syria as well before the civil war there. And in Turkey, very much. There's a lot of people in Turkey who are specializing in the study of the Hittites and the prehistory of their region. So it's shifting. It's not going away though. I think okay.
Yeah, that's good to know. Which is a great segue into my next question I actually had is kind of going back into the archaeology aspect of it. When recent discoveries are made, I mean, for example, I don't know if there's any recent that you could share, but when they do make recent discoveries, do you and other historians gather together and kind of like jump on it for the excitement, or have you actually been contacted to decipher some things?
Well, the way it works is that when an excavation is taking place in any of the countries of the Middle East, it has its own what's called an epigraphist. So the person who is going to be the person who will work on the tablets if they are found. So that's the person who, on that excavation, if they find tablets, if they find cuneiform tablets, that person has the wonderful joy of getting to publish them. And I haven't worked as an epigrapher on an excavation. And so for me, I have published some documents that were in museums, because there's 500,000 or more cuneiform documents in museums around the world. And most of them aren't published. And so there's plenty of work for people to do without, even thinking about the ones that are coming out of the excavations. But when they do come, of course, yes, there's a tremendous excitement. There's a site called Girsu in southern Mesopotamia that was excavated in the early 20th century. And there's a new excavation going on there now. And they've just announced that they found a couple of hundred cuneiform texts. So of course, yes, we want to know what's in them. It's very exciting to hear that. But it's a slow process to get them published, of course, because they're not necessarily easy to read. The person who's publishing them has to put aside a big chunk of time to decipher them, to figure them out, to make sense of them, and to put them in a historical context. So there's often quite a wait between when the announcement of, aha, we found tablets, and then for those of us in the field to actually know what's in them. But that said, there are some new, especially digital resources that are speeding things up wonderfully. So there's a website called ORAC, which stands for the Open Richly Annotated Cuneiform Corpus. And they have a lot of projects on that site where they're putting up what are called transliterations of cuneiform tablets, which means that they are not necessarily translated, but they're written out sign by sign, so you can read them without seeing the cuneiform. You see how it would have been pronounced in Akkadian or Sumerian. But they also have some translations as well on that site, which is great. Then there's another website called the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, where they're taking photographs in museums around the world of cuneiform tablets and putting them up on their website. And they have thousands and thousands of, hundreds of thousands, I think at this point, of images of cuneiform documents, so that you can find them without having to go to the Berlin Museum or without having to go to the British Museum. You can actually just pull them up on your computer, which is fantastic. And really makes it so much easier to do work in my field, because it used to be when I was doing my PhD, you had to physically go to the place where the tablets were. So I went to Berlin and I went to New York and I went to London, to see the tablets that I was working on, because they were in those collections. Now you don't have to anymore. They're available. Not every single one of them. There's still plenty of work to be done in archives where you have to open drawers and find old tablets. But a lot of them are available online, and that's exciting.
Well, that's the beauty of technology, right? Everything's becoming digitized.
Yes, and they're working on AI to be able to read them, which would be incredible. because that is that's where you say how many
Mhm.
people can do this. That's one of the limiting factors of how many can be published, is there just aren't that many people who can read them. And if if AI can master reading cuneiform, that would be brilliant. Really,
It's
really.
brilliant and scary, right?
Yeah, no, not so really. I think it wouldn't put us out of business at all, because there's plenty to be done. But
Mhm.
it would mean that it would um, just make so, because the vast majority of these tablets are not literary. They're not
Mhm.
poems and hymns and things that you may need a human being to look at. They're lists of cows and sheep and
Mhm.
people and contracts and court cases and there's a lot of very formulaic documents which lend themselves to quantitative history. Honestly, the kind of work you can do on changes in the cost of land, or you can even see economic crises based on
Mhm.
the value of things, and all kinds of stuff that you can see through those. And if a machine can translate them, fantastic. That saves somebody a lot of grunt work.
Oh yeah.
There's just a lot of them.
Yeah, okay. So one thing I was curious about, as we talked about um just the tablets, right? As you mentioned that they document events, whether it's product or material, and you mentioned something that was interesting. It was how to communicate between each other
Mhm.
and communicating from one kingdom to another. And even though on a map it may not seem far, at that time it was relatively far. So when looking at that in either, I mean, I don't know, however you want to kind of guide this, whether it was a letter from one king to another or family member to another, whether it
Mhm.
was like a diplomatic envoy, um, did as far as you know, did they actually give themselves a grace period for responses, or was it they're like a generic time frame?
That's such a good question. There's a wonderful period of history that lasted from about 1400 to about 1200 BC, very, very generally, in which the five major powers in the Middle East were all at peace with one another. This was Egypt, Mesopotamia, well, Babylonia in Mesopotamia. There was a kingdom called Mitanni, which was in northern Mesopotamia, and there was a kingdom called Hatti in Anatolia. And the kings of these states, um, and also the island of Cyprus, interestingly enough, although it wasn't on the same scale, it also had one of these kings who was part of this group. They considered themselves brothers, which meant that they were allies, and they had peace treaties among themselves so that they wouldn't invade one another. And they sent these envoys back and forth with letters, and that was their way of keeping their peaceful relationship. And the envoys also sent gifts. So there were these very extravagant gifts they would send. And it was a long, long journey. As you say, it's not today, texts are instant, right?
Mm-hmm.
There, it was at the least 6 weeks to travel between any of
Wow.
those capital cities. And so, and sometimes as much as 3 months of travel. And then when you got there, you had to wait for the king to reply. And so then you had to go back. So the norm was that you would send an envoy once a year, and um, that he would be given enough time to wait. And they were treated well. These envoys would arrive, and it was like being a secretary of state. You arrive, you're given banquets, you're given a beautiful place to stay, and then you wait for the other king to respond to your king's letter and to send gifts back. But it does seem as though at some point they were anxious to leave, because there are some of these letters from the kings. They're called the Amarna letters. They were found in Egypt. They're written in cuneiform. All these great kings wrote to one another using the Akkadian language in writing in cuneiform, and you'll get these letters like from the king of Babylonia saying, my envoy left 6 years ago and he hasn't come back yet, and I think it's time to send him home. They were sort of polite, but they were also, you could tell that there was some serious annoyance there. So yes, it was certainly allowed to keep the envoy for a few months, but when it started stretching into years, that was definitely not okay. They never threatened one another with military engagement. It was never like, if you don't send my envoy back, I'm sending my troops. Never. It was often, I'm not going to send you a gift until you send my envoy back. And those gifts were worth so much to them. But that was real serious pressure. If I'm not going to get the horses I want from Babylonia, maybe I will send the envoy back. Or the envoy was being kept
because they wanted something. And it's like, well, I'll send your envoy back when you send me that gold, but right now, come on, gold needs to come. So it was they were important men and ambassadors, but they were also kind of bargaining chips. And it must have been a very interesting job. I
Oh
think,
yeah, it sounds actually like a nice job, nice lavish job.
Not bad, not bad. As long as you weren't being held, and even then they weren't held captive. They were, still wined and dined and lived in beautiful style. They just couldn't go home until such time as the king let them. But one of the things that really intrigues me about this period, besides the fact that they were at peace, which is so interesting, because it's before the great empires, before the Neo-Assyrian Empire sort of conquered the entire region. And it does seem as though these five powers recognized that they were incapable of conquering one another, that they didn't have the manpower and the arms to take over an equally powerful king at such a distance. And that it worked out better for them to be allied. They could, it was so much cheaper, you didn't have to send troops up, you didn't, and you could get all of the wealth that you wanted from those neighboring kings by these luxury gift exchanges. And there was time of like Amenhotep III in Egypt was one of the richest kings of all time. Partly, I think, because he didn't have to fight. He wasn't for an army. But that's one intriguing thing. The other intriguing thing, I think, is about the translators, because they were all using Akkadian as the Mesopotamian language, but that wasn't their native language. So you'd have an Egyptian king writing in Akkadian to the king of Mitanni, whose native language was Hurrian. So you must have translators who are trilingual, who can speak Egyptian and Hurrian and Akkadian in order to make that work. And so there's a lot of really sophisticated translation going on in that period as well. It's really a fascinating period.
That is fascinating. And what makes me think, did they, I don't even know, do they have a form of like a system to learn a language, or do they just send an envoy out there and, hey, go learn and then come back?
No, we know they had schools. In fact, they found a school in Egypt where they trained them to read and write in cuneiform. So they had, you find school texts, which they had a sort of shared curriculum across Mesopotamia. They would learn this, they would do the same kind of exercises, and they would learn the same texts and copy the same words. And that same curriculum is found in this school in Egypt, where what seems to have happened is the Egyptian king hired a Mesopotamian, probably a Syrian actually, schoolmaster to come and set up a school so that his scribes could learn the language and learn the script, so that when they went, they would not just be able to write, they could write it properly. It's not something you can really pick up on the job. It's something that is a very sophisticated writing system that they would need to be trained in, and in the language as well. Yeah.
Oh wow, that's incredibly interesting. I'm enjoying this more and more.
It's really fun. There's so many things like this that you can go down a rabbit hole with any one of them. It's sort of, you start reading and people have done all this research. And it's one reason I wrote the book I just wrote, actually, the Weavers, Scribes and Kings that you mentioned, because I wanted to be able to write a book that anyone could pick up and make sense of, with all this fascinating stuff that people have been doing research in, so that it's not something you have to go and find for yourself in the journals and academic books in which it's published, but where I can kind of introduce it. And then if it's something that the reader is interested in, I've got this big bibliography and notes where you can go in and learn more. But in writing it, I found all kinds of cool stuff that I didn't know myself. It's really fun.
Yeah, and what I think is, in kind of going back to what we talked about, where it's not as, I guess, widely sought after. When you were doing that book, was there anything as far as, well, you mentioned new discoveries. Was it new discoveries in the sense of new tablets coming out, or deciphered tablets that you added later on?
Yeah, I tried to make it as up to date as possible. So I put in recent discoveries, tablets that have just been found, and tablets that have been known for a long time but that have been reinterpreted. So there's some wonderful work. The title includes the weavers. And there are some scholars who've been doing work on weaving women in a number of different eras, because textiles were the main export from Mesopotamia. That was their most valuable export for a long period of time. They made beautiful textiles, which I say that, never seen them because they've all disintegrated, but you can tell from the way they're described, from the amount of time involved in their manufacture, they must have been amazing. And the weaving
the weaving workshops. They had spinners, they had weavers, they had dyers, they had embroiderers, people who made hems, you know, all kinds of people who were involved in textile manufacture. A lot of them were women, and they were hired by the palace or the temple to make these luxury goods. And a group of scholars have been working on what look like very boring tablets. I mean, they are literally just lists of rations that are given to the women who are working in those weaving workshops. But they trace the names of, you know, where does this woman's name appear? Where does she appear in this tablet? Where does she appear here? How much is she getting paid here? How much is she getting paid here? Is she moving up in the hierarchy? Oh, this same woman is now the supervisor of that team. And
Wow.
This isn't work that I personally did. This is work that I completely indebted to the women who they happen to be female scholars who've done the research on them. Most of them, that's not entirely true. Some men have worked on it as well. But the scholars who've worked on this have found these amazing things. And what I decided to do with my book was to take what they'd done and turn it into microhistory, which as a historian, you understand microhistory, but a microhistory taking what is a very narrow study initially about weaving women and trying to use it to understand their whole world. So looking at the world beyond the weaving workshop, looking at the relationships in the palace, the context of the woman who was running, the queen who was running these weaving workshops in her palace, so that you can take this little microcosm of the weaving workshop and understand a whole lot about the 24th century BCE, as it happens, from by using them as kind of the starting point and looking outwards at their world. And it's really fun. But as I say, so much has been done by so many scholars, and I'm so indebted to them, because some of the research in the book is on my own topics that I've done the original work in the primary sources, but it's 3,000 years of history. So a lot of it is other people's work that I have tried to put into a coherent format and use this sort of microhistory approach throughout the book, so that it pulls together different strands that have been done by different scholars to make more of a coherent story.
Yeah, and it's so cool, because even now, like in studying it, you know, like you mentioned, there's different types of history, and I liked how you noted, which, you know, something I picked up was you take something in this micro aspect, but you're able to articulate it across all the different types of histories. And from what I've noticed recently in some micro histories, like gender history, for example, is an exploding field. Now, when you look at that, was it when you looked into that area, was it just weavers, or were there actually other written aspects of women in that society that played a pivotal role?
Yes, so much. This is one of the great things about the field, is that women are, you don't have to go searching for women in the ancient Middle East. There are so many women who can be in the history. And they're not just weavers, they're brewers, they're innkeepers, they are officials, there are some scribes, there are physicians, there are queens and princesses and priestesses, lots of really powerful priestesses. So the book is full of women, because what I decided to do was each chapter, rather than looking at the era sort of writ large, I would choose someone through whose eyes we will look at that period. And sometimes it's a queen or a king. Often, I mean, there are lots of queens and kings in this. And sometimes it was a weaving woman, and sometimes it was, you know, in one case, a musician, two musicians, they were girls when they started in their careers, and then they grew up and they got married, and you look at their lives. But I wanted to look at a lot of different professions, and the professions I was choosing, some of them had to be women. That was who was doing that profession. And so it was, yes, it's a field in which there is plenty to do in terms of gender studies and women's history. But I didn't do it through the lens of gender theory or anything like that. This is a book for someone who walks into Barnes and Noble, ideally. So this is a book where it's about men, it's about women, it's about children, it's about rich people, it's about poor people, it's about everybody. And I wanted to make it accessible that way, so that you felt that this was a world where you can see the wide variety of people and what they were doing.
Oh, I love it. And for those that are interested in buying the book, you can get it on Amazon. For us Broncos, get it. If you get it, we might be able to negotiate maybe a book signing.
Oh, that would be fun. The other thing too, I wanted to let you know, is that there's an audiobook coming out of it. They decided, after it had been out for a few months, to license an audiobook. and they asked me to read it. So I'm the reader on the audiobook that's coming out in late March, so later this month. So that will be really fun. So.
That sounds like a pressure to read everything perfectly.
Oh my gosh, it was insane. I have such respect for audiobook readers, the narrators. They have a hard job because I know I wrote the book, so I should have been able to do a good job at it. And I kept getting tongue-tied, and so you'd have to go back and reread a sentence. And I'm thinking, if it was a book that I didn't read, that I know my book backwards because I've read it so many times. Imagine doing that as a reader of a book that you didn't write. It's impressive. That's a tough job. So it was work, but I really enjoyed doing it.
That sounds that sounds fun to me.
Yeah,
like listen, I know in the age of podcasts and everything, I mean, that's definitely something to listen to on the way home, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Hope so. People buy it.
So there's something I want to ask is kind of like I think I'm going to make it the trend of the exiting question is, so for people who are students, like, they're interested in the ancient world that don't want to take on the poster children of Greece and Rome, and hopefully Dr. DeVore doesn't hang me for that one.
No. Greece and Rome are wonderful, and I don't, absolutely, they are fascinating and brilliant fields, and I'm not in any way maligning them. Just pointing out there are more fields to ancient history. Yes,
right, of course, right. So for those that may be interested in taking that route, and with the understanding that there's not an abundance of opportunity, is there any advice that you'd like to give for those that are entering that area?
Oh yeah, I mean, if you're just sort of doing reading on your own, there are a lot of books in the field that are well written, that are exploring different sides to this field. So if, for example, we talked about women's history, if you're interested in women's history, there are plenty of books that are written about women in the ancient Middle East. There's books about women in ancient Egypt. And I think the place to find it is to go to a bibliography of a book you like and see what they used, because that's even though it's very low tech, and it's obviously you can do searches online as well, but when you see authors who come up over and over again in the bibliographies of the books that you like, you think, oh, that person's obviously doing interesting work, maybe I can find that. And especially for students at Cal Poly, you have such a fabulous resource with our library, because there are so many ebooks available. So even if the book isn't on the shelves, you can find almost anything you need. And there's the journal articles through JSTOR if you get really sort of interested. Students don't often do this field for a senior thesis, but the ones who have done it find that there's so much translated into English that there's plenty of primary sources available. And there's tons of just unfathomable amounts of secondary source material. Any topic you pick, you can find so much that's been done and so much that's left to be done. So there's some possibilities there. But I've had a number of students do a senior thesis in a topic in the ancient Middle East, and they have done brilliantly. I mean, they've got a lot of material, but also the possibility of doing something kind of original, because since there are not that many historians in the field, there's some interesting possibilities of things to look into.
Oh, definitely. And especially they have a great point of contact, while you're still here.
Well, I mean, I will, even after I've officially retired, which is in 2025, I'll have the same email address and they can still find me. So, and I'm sure by then I'll be missing students so much that I'll be like, oh yes, absolutely.
Just come back and teach for fun.
Yeah, right. Well, they might have to pay me, but I might, there is I would come back as a lecturer, but that would be fine. I like teaching classes.
Oh, definitely. Well, thank you so much for taking the time and doing this. We definitely appreciate it. And, for those that are interested, again, her book is on Amazon.
Yes.
Both of them, actually, I don't know if all of them are, they might.
Yes, all of them. I think there's 5 or 6, I lose track, but it depends what you define as a book. But yeah, there's 5 books on Amazon, and then I did a course for a Wondrium, which is also, I mean, it took writing a book to do it, but I didn't end up, I did it as an audio visual course rather than a book. But yes, they're all there.
Yeah, so if you haven't gotten it yet, do it. If you haven't taken a class with her yet, go for it. You'll probably see me next semester, hopefully, fingers crossed.
Actually, no, next semester, because I'm in the faculty early retirement program. I only teach this semester. I don't teach in the
fall. Okay, so spring for those of us that know.
Year, and then spring of 2025. Yeah,
spring of 2025 then. Well, thank you for coming and definitely appreciate it. And we'll see you around on campus.
Thanks, Jeremy. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thanks.
And thank you.
Take care.